Okay, I think that we will slowly start. So welcome to this seminar of the Interdisciplinary Research Cluster on Transnational Democracy in the 21st Century. If you don't know me, my name is Filip Kostelka. I'm professor in the SPS department, and I co-convene the cluster together with Professor Kalypso Nikolaidis, who is coming back, I guess, who sits in the room. And yeah. So now I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jacques Rupnik, Emeritus Professor at Sciences Po Paris at the Center of International Studies, Centre d'études internationales, CRI. Professor Rupnik is one of the most eminent scholars and intellectuals studying Central and Eastern Europe. He was born in the region, but he pursued his studies at the Sorbonne and INALCO in France, at Harvard University in the United States. Throughout his absolutely outstanding academic career, he published numerous books and scholarly articles. His signature publication, The Other Europe, has been translated into a dozen of languages and was a companion to a famous documentary of the same name, published by Britain's Channel 4. And so as you can see, Professor Rupnik's career extends well beyond academia. He worked for more than 5 years as Eastern Europe analyst for the BBC World Service. He was the executive director of the International Commission for the Balkans, a member of the Independent International Commission on Kosovo, and advisor to the last Czechoslovak president and the first Czech president, Václav Havel, among other significant roles. So I think that Professor Rupnik's prominent career perfectly epitomizes the mission of the EUI widening program that aims to bring the West and the East together, the academic communities of the two regions. And that's one of the reasons why we created here at the EUI a prize in his honor for the best EUI presentation, basically during the workshop on Central and Eastern Europe that takes place in June. This is the prize for the best contribution, and this was created in Professor Rupnik's honor. And so now Professor Rupnik will deliver a presentation that lies at the core of his expertise, which focuses on democratic developments in Central and Eastern Europe and rather undemocratic developments, I guess. So Professor Rupnik, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be back. Seeing young Zielonka here, I cannot not mention that in the 1990s, there was abundance of seminars, projects, colloquia on the subject of democratic transitions. And Jean Blondel, Philippe Schmitter, okay, a number of people, very eminent scholars associated with the center, were interested in East Central Europe, although that was not their initial specialty, because that's where the stakes were: democratization and European integration. And indeed, can I get this? Is this working? No. Yeah.
Just let me check if we are sharing the screen.
Oh, okay. So sharing the screen and sharing thoughts with you. Anyway, so this was the main agenda of the Times, and it's interesting to obviously reflect on that, to see how far the situation have changed, because I've been asked to come here not to talk about democratic transformation, but about democratic regression. And it coincides not so much with a great elan for European enlargement and integration, but rather the opposite. Not everywhere, not in the same way, but we're seeing the opposite trend. The main context for for our discussion today, and I will not dwell on it, but clearly you have two things. You have a war in Ukraine, which is framed for Europeans in, among others, I'm not saying this is the only dimension of the war, in terms of, democratic transformation or authoritarian imperialism. This is a dilemma, and it's a question posed to the Ukrainians, obviously, but it's a question posed to all Europeans. So this is a new context in which we debating the European dimension of enlargement of the European Union. And as you know, Ukraine has been given the prospect of future enlargement. And the second context is the election of Donald Trump and the interesting interplay between the newly elected American president and the only European leader he has dared mention during the whole campaign since the beginning of the year, and that's Viktor Orbán. 3 times, even received a visit of Viktor Orbán in Florida. So there you have it. You have now American colleagues discussing to what extent the Orbán model of dismantling the state, independent public administration, rule of law, to what extent that can be relevant for understanding what Trump's agenda will be. And then you have the reverse, the Trumpization of Europe and the way Europeans respond to the election of Trump, starting obviously with Viktor Orbán, but also a number of others. I will not go through the whole list now because that would take us into another discussion. But I just came from Prague yesterday, and even there, you would be surprised. So this is interesting. Urbanization of America, Trumpization of Europe under Viktor Orbán's leadership. That is the context in which we are talking about this issue. I'm just mentioning this because, 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, at the time of the enlargement, we had seminars here. We had a project on Czech and Slovak roads to the EU, okay? So that's the contrast of the period. So this is the first thing I want to mention. The paradigm that we were discussing at the time was fairly neat. Democratic transition, integration into the European Union. Transition, consolidation, meaning you have alternation in power, and you have constitutionalism as a binding principle. And all that, of course, fitted in the European integration agenda. And that's what I would like to discuss, how to, well, more raise questions and give many answers, but basically, how has the populist nationalist challenge transformed these polities, and how to define them? That is an important question. We don't have a neat niche. I mean, the word populism has been used, populism, authoritarianism, etc. They are not the same thing. And okay, there is a debate about how to define them, and we will get to that, I'm sure. How to explain, that is a third theme I would like to broach. We are in Italy, and you know Pirandello's play, 6 characters in search of an author, 6 personnages en quête d'auteur, wonderful play. Well, I have 6 hypotheses in search of a regression. And I mentioned in the PowerPoint 5 because my 6 hypothesis is in the conclusion, but it's a 6 hypothesis that I will try briefly, and Philip will watch the clock. I must get started. And obviously, my last question, my last theme will be to see not only the diversity of the phenomenon, its limits, and also the new challenging question, how to dismantle an illiberal democracy. Hasn't been done before. Poland is a laboratory of change, so we'll get to that. I can go, I think, to this audience who is familiar with this whole debates of the past about the transitions, therefore I will not dwell on it. Transition, consolidation. The consolidation is very important because it meant not just that you had an alternation in power. Usually, I remember in the literature, they said you need 2 elections to think that it's become irreversible, okay? And there was the idea that constitutionalism matters. That means all actors accepted the constitutional framework as constraining. So that was what constitutionalism was about, and that is precisely what has been challenged over the last decade by the populists, by the transition reverse, as I call it, and moving towards illiberal democracies, which Viktor Orbán adopted as his term. It's not our judgment. It is his self-description in a famous 2014 speech he gave, and he described at length what he meant by it, and how he very proudly and categorically rejected the ideas of liberal democracy. And before we get started, I will have to be brief on that, but it's worth looking at some of the ways democracies has been assessed by a number of institutions. It is always difficult to assess democracy, but if you take simply the Freedom House index that you are familiar with, and it's not interesting to take it over just 1 year. What is interesting is to take it over a period. And well, you can see, even in very broad strokes. Ça va pas? On peut enlever Kvasniak? Can you, oh, sorry, can you remove this man? I don't mean literally, I mean just from the screen. So clearly you have the way Southern Europe has moved closer to Western Europe, and since the 1980s, basically, that was, if you remember the third wave, Huntington's third wave of democratization, well, that was it. And then you have, of course, the Central Europe catching up with them, basically, arriving at a similar level. Southeastern Europe, that is the Balkans, as you know, and the post-Soviet, well, that was then still the category. Well, it was the most convenient way at the time. I know that now the diversity is greater, but this was basically post-Soviet without the Baltics. And at the bottom of the heap, so to speak, you have Central Asia. They were there from the beginning, and they remained there. So how do we, does it move forward? No. Okay, it's the same thing, but updated. I did this update. This is the latest 2014 evaluation. I guess it's too small to be read, so I will skip it. You will have just to take my word for it. What is interesting is not that, you know, Slovene democracy is fine for 5.76. Well, you know, it's too scientific to be true. This is not to be. It's not the exact figure. I don't know how they come to this figure. What is interesting is that you have a same group of countries of Central Europe, that over a quarter of a century are always more or less in the block, in the top. Then you have a second group of countries, usually, well, they used to be Romania, Bulgaria, and then you have all the countries of former Yugoslavia, the Balkan countries, etc. That was a kind of second group. And you have, again, then you have further down the list, you get to Russia and Central Asia, etc. So what you saw on the curve, you have it here, but it was changes. Suddenly, Hungary and Poland had dropped. Poland is changing now, and in the next, it will be certainly with an improved grade next year in Freedom House grade. I mean, incidentally, I mean, I will not comment on the other tables because they were Freedom House, and I used other evaluation. Of course, you have a number of institutes that are doing that, Bertelsmann, etc. I cannot inflict on you all of that in the limited time I have, but here is the expert here. If you need something on this region and the data, you will have to turn to him. But what is interesting here, this is the Variety of Democracy report. This is a Swedish university in Gothenburg. And they assess, first of all, Hungary lost the free status. They're partly free since 2019. In the Variety of Democracy report, well, you can read, I suppose I don't have to read everything, but the top 10 regressing countries by magnitude, Hungary is particularly striking. It ranks first in contemporary autocratization. Well, that's some achievement for a member of the EU, no? And then you have, in a comparative perspective, they put, you know, because they go global, of course, in their assessment. So they have Turkey, Poland, Brazil, India, etc. And they still consider that Hungary emerges as the first member of the EU ever to host an electoral authoritarian regime. So they go further. They don't just say illiberal, they go to further, they say electoral authoritarian. We'll get to that. Okay, I must not continue, but just to complete the assessment, the main features, this is what Polish constitutionalist, professor of law, Wojciech Sadurski, wrote in his book at Oxford University Press. You can read it, but basically dismantling the major checks and balances of the Polish state, subordinating the court, the public administration, and so on, etc. So this is basically what we are dealing with. This is what the illiberal democracy stands for. Incidentally, this is one of the rare occurrences where a term borrowed from political science or used by political scientists is being adopted by politicians. Fareed Zakaria, well, who is now a journalist, but he had a PhD from Harvard, and he first published his article on illiberal democracy in foreign affairs that you probably know. Incidentally, in those days, well, he made an interesting point then, and very few people took it too seriously because it was spoiling the global picture of the triumphal democracy after 1989. He was then pointing to the fact, yes, you have proliferation of democratic elections around the world, in Eastern Europe, of course, but elsewhere as well. But he said the most striking thing is that you have formidable progress of electoral democracy without necessarily the rule of law. And historically, democracy in the West has developed by first developing institutions of the rule of law and gradually extending institutions of democracy and democratic participation and democratic legitimation. So you had a kind of different take, different order, let's say, in the relationship between rule of law and elections. And now, interestingly, that term has been adopted by Viktor Orbán in the speech I mentioned. In the 1990s, the countries they mentioned, I mean, Fareed Zakaria had listed, you know, Pakistan, etc. You had also, but he also countries in Africa, and then he mentioned Slovakia. It was Slovakia under Mečiar. Then nationalist, populist, authoritarian. Okay, we already had a first take on it. It didn't go as far as as some of the disciples, one would say today, because Fico is a disciple in a way. But he was supposed to present a light. He was supposed to present for me, when Fico came on the stage in the 2000s, he was supposed to be prepare the soft landing for the Mečiar project and for the Mečiar electorate, so to speak. So you had the big upsurge, all united against Mečiar, and that's what allowed Slovakia to catch up and join the European Union. But then you had the return of Fico. But that was Fico light, that was Mečiar light, let's say. Now we had Mečiar, Mečiar Orbán, whatever comparison you want to be. Fico is giving us a very different, this is no longer Mečiar light, this is very hard light. You have the quotes, Šoljom, ex-president Constitutional Court, he said that. When did he say that? He said that immediately after the Hungarian parliament, where Fidesz had 2/3 majority, overruled a decision by the Constitutional Court that were taken before, previous decisions by the Constitution. And this, Šoljom said, this is retroactive justice, and this simply is breaking the fundamental principle of the rule of law. So he says, rule of law ceased to exist. This is 2011. Okay. I interviewed Mr. Rzepliński, the former head of the Polish Constitutional Court, and he told me that what PiS was doing was simply dismantling the rule of law in Poland. And then I said, trying to correct perhaps this very severe judgment, said, but perhaps, the lady who is in charge of the Constitutional Court, she will be trying to limit the damage. I said, limit the damage? Not at all. This lady has no competence whatsoever to be at the head of that institution. Tells me, Mr. Rzepliński. Okay, so pretty severe judgment. I cannot go into the details, but the main features, as you can see, is rule of law, media. The first thing the illiberals go after is public broadcasting media. In Hungary, in Poland, Fico does exactly that. Now in Slovakia, this is the pattern. You go first after public broadcasting. I mean, Poland, 240 journalists sacked in the first year in office by PiS. And you have, I should have added here, I simply added because I don't have the time, public administration. Politicization of public administration, you sack people, you replace ambassadors, etc., etc. Central bank, of course. You go after institutions that are supposedly, presumably politically neutral, such as the central bank. And you go after them because you say they are not politically neutral, we want our political appointee there. So, rule of law, media, public administration, and you go after civil society, especially in Hungary, the law on foreign agents, which is the Putinesque law. It's borrowed straight from Vladimir Vladimirovich. Just for the illustration, that quote about, I mentioned Trump and Orbán. After the first election of Trump in 2016, the day after, Orbán gives an interview to the Daily Telegraph where he says the following. He says, Brexit opened the door. Trump's election, we crossed the threshold. And that's when he says, liberal democracy is over. What a day, what a day, what a day. He repeats it 3 times in the interview. He is over the top. He says, because what does it mean? You point finger at us saying we are backward East European retrogrades who do not understand liberal democracy the European way. No, we were ahead of the game. We were the vanguard. And when he says in that sentence, Brexit opened the door, Trump crossed the threshold, this is it. He said, we were the vanguard, we were ahead of the game. And actually now the new election of Trump and the way Trump treats Orbán as the prime interlocutor in Europe, which is quite extravagant, one must say, vindicates him and his approach. You read the other quotes. I must get to the substance. In 1990, there was in Warsaw a conference at which Bronisław Geremek, I don't have to introduce Geremek here, no, this audience knows, great Polish historians, figure, intellectual, politician, etc. In 1990, Bronisław Geremek, at that conference, remember 1990, all the conferences were celebrating basically, the irreversible tide of history, end of history, some thought, well, some of us were not as limited as that, but still, that was the ethos of the time, the great democratic way. At that very time, Geremek came to the conference, and as a historian, of course, he starts making reservations, and you see the quote, but I think it's three perils for the countries that are democratizing. One, populism. Why? Because we've inherited from the communist era the idea of them and us. We, the people, the innocent people, they, the communist nomenclatura, them and us. And that is a form of populism. And that is, of course, in a democratic context, that can be a problem. So that populism, he says, will be the first obstacle. The second danger, he says, is temptation to establish strong government. He says, because it's after the communist system collapsed, it's also state institutions, the chaos, society is transformed, economy is transformed, the political institutions, law and order is fragile. You look for a strong hand, you look for strong power. And so Geremek thinks the authoritarian temptation may be there. And his third danger in the transitional phase is nationalism, and I will return to that. But I think, I mean, chapeau, no? Give the man his due. 1990, everybody's democratic transition, transitology, you know, this huge academic industry of uneven quality, let's say, comes Geremek as a historian. He's a medieval historian by chance, by training. So he has this view, this long view, and he knows the history of not just Poland, of East Central Europe as a whole. And okay, that was his take. And I said, yeah, because that was well, you proclaim political egalitarianism. We are all citizens, we can all participate. Okay, this is equality, civic equality that you have acquired in 1989, but egalitarianism, which is widespread in societies of East Central Europe in terms of income distribution, disparities, you know. Let's keep it for discussion. I mean, these were countries where doctors and engineers were earning less than miners, okay? So that's what you have to, egalitarianism was part of the communist approach. And he said that egalitarianism may, okay, I still think Geremek chapeau, and that's why he's here. I move promptly to my 5 hypotheses, but I said there were 6, and the 6 is the conclusion. 5 hypotheses. First, the socio-economic explanation. Well, this is probably the most familiar in the whole literature and populism. Again, I don't think I will have to go too much into that, but it has dominated a lot of the literature. Basically, how globalization and disindustrialization, the erosion of the middle class, and particularly hitting the lower middle class, etc. And well, the deplorables, as one American candidate for presidency put it. So this is it. And you had this idea. May I give you, since I'm mentioning American president, Richard Rorty, you know, the political philosopher, wonderful man. I remember a seminar, in Virginia he had organized, where he, for the first time, drew my attention to what may be coming. Here is a quote from him, and I will not inflict the whole thing. I put it in. I know it's about America and the world, but just if you look at what he basically, he describes in the 90s, in the moment of greatest triumphalism of so-called market democracies. Remember that some of our conferences then were called transitions to market democracies, as if it was the same thing. I mean, you can have transition to democracy, you can have transition to the market. They are, of course, intertwined, but they're distinct. It's not the same thing. But the liberal discourse of the 90s had too much attendance. Anyway, at that point, something will crack, says Richard Rorty, the beginning of the non-suburban electorate will decide that the system has failed them, and they start looking around for a strong man to vote for, etc. Well, you can see the quote. I will not go on to it, but he was onto something. Of course, he was writing about America, but I think you want to understand what happened elsewhere, including about peace in Poland, including about others varieties of the same phenomenon elsewhere. Yes, and clearly, you know, when people talk about the two Polands, yeah, but you can have two Czechias. You know, you look at the vote for Schwarzenberg and Miloš Zeman. Prague, 75% Schwarzenberg. Who wins the country? Zeman. You look at where he has the big votes, etc. You know, the tale of two nations. The tale of two nations. That is what we have in America, but that is what we have in many European situations. Okay, I cannot, and that, of course, is the background. I think the literature has perhaps overstressed, sometimes only using that. I'm using many more explanatory hypotheses, and we can discuss which you think is most relevant or how to combine them. The second, very important, is populism and nationalism. When you say rise of populism, okay, it has this socio-economic background, but it has specific features in countries where the nation is a cultural nation, to use the German term, Kulturnation, you know, language, culture, religious connection often. It's not the French model, you know, it's not the state that builds the nation, you know, and that French Revolution completes, so to speak, the process that the monarchy had done simply by giving citizenship, giving it a civic dimension. Then, well, you know, that's Eugene Weber's book, Peasants into Frenchmen. Okay, that's one road, but you know, sometimes the French have difficult understanding that the East Europeans are not French. Their model of nation-state building was rather different. And if you're a country like Poland that disappears from the map at the end of the 18th century and reappears after World War I, well, then you have to understand what that means. Anyway, the key author for that, just as Richard Rorty is for the first hypothesis. The key author for the second hypothesis is István Bibó. István Bibó wrote this great book, La misère des petits États d'Europe de l'Est, the misery of small nations, small states of Eastern Europe. And this is a book that he published in 1944. And he's reflecting about what happened before. So he has three parts. He has one about German hysteria, how German nationalism turned into fascism, Nazism, and imperialism, etc. He has a part about the Jewish question. And he reflects about what happened in the 1930s. And he has this phrase where he says, the most dangerous time for democracy, for liberty. No, the most dangerous time for democracy comes when the cause of liberty comes into conflict with the cause of the nation. And that's a crucial moment. What Orbán has done with the migration crisis, I mean, when I say Orbán, I can give you the Fico, Kaczynski, all of them, have done with the migration crisis in 2015 is to frame it in those terms. We are protecting the nation because it is threatened by liberty, by the liberal open door, by the liberal human rights discourse, etc., etc. So this is a crucial thing. I must speed up. Third, I'm sorry if the hypothesis, I can go on for half an hour for about each hypothesis, but I won't. The third hypothesis, the culture war. There's a book by Richard Legutko, which is about what he calls a new totalitarianism. The totalitarian temptation, he calls it in the title of his book. And you know, in the 1980s, Jean-François Revel published a book, La Tentation totalitaire, and that was about communism, statism, and that kind of thing. So that was a totalitarian temptation, as Jean-François. So he takes the title about the totalitarian. He says, no, the new totalitarian temptation is the liberals. It's the liberals who are now the totalitarian threat because they are after the family, the church, the nation. The three institutions. In the name of individual freedom, they sacrifice the collective, the groups, the family, the nation, the church. And this very much, I think this, the idea that the liberal individualism is promoting an assault on the key institutions that hold the society, the nation together. So that is Legutko's take. I don't buy it, of course, but I think that the culture wars he is pointing to, everything that has to do with gender, race, LGBT, etc., etc. There's a whole category of so-called societal liberalism. So this is no longer liberalism in the sense of the rule of law, separation of powers, institution. This is societal liberalism. And that is a crucial ingredient in the way populists mobilize against liberal institutions, and particularly the European Union. There is a fourth argument, again, I won't have time to go into, but it's the historical weakness of liberalism. If you look at today, why is it not faring so well? Well, one hypothesis may be, well, when did it fare so well? You know, and there were not that many periods when it did. And of course, people used to say, yeah, Czechoslovakia between the wars, that was the exception that confirms the rule. You have a book by Antony Polonsky, The Little Dictators, about the interwar period in East Central Europe, well, you go country by country, and it says, well, it starts with a democratic ambition, 1918, just like 1989, we build in democracy, and within a decade, basically, they have regressed to not fascism, but sort of semi-authoritarian regime. So there is perhaps that argument. There are historians such as Ivan Berendt, in particular, who takes a long view. I mean, you can take a long view and go back to the second serfdom in East Central. That was a divide between East and West. You go to the weakness, the historical weakness of the bourgeoisie in East Central Europe, which is related to the weakness of the industrial development, of course, and the fact that often the bourgeoisie, particularly take the case of Hungary, was made of Germans and Jews. And so the national thing became conflated with rejection of the bourgeois liberalism, etc., etc. Anyway, I can't go into that. You want to read a great book, is Jedlicky's book, What Civilization Does Poland Need? Great book. He's not talking about Kaczynski, he's talking about 19th century. He's talking about modernization and attitudes of Polish society and Polish culture towards modernization and transformation. Yeah, the attitude towards modernity, that goes back to the 19th century. The historical argument is clearly interesting. I mentioned, I have mentioned Oskar Jászai. In the discussion, I can explain why. Great Hungarian political thinker and historian of the Habsburg Empire also. Finally, the exhaustion of the liberal cycle, that would be the sixth hypothesis. Isn't it simply that the modernizing, liberal, democratizing elites of post-1989 have exhausted what they had to offer, and that we have cycles in political history, and that brings me to a comparison. If I have to take one author who has nothing to do, he doesn't say one word about East Central Europe, but it's reading his book I really thought of this cycle. I had written a piece for the 20th anniversary about the exhaustion of the cycle. My piece was basically about what did we want in '89? Democracy, market transformation, Europe. All three are in crisis because we were just after the economic crisis, the financial crisis of 2008. Democracy was beginning to be undermined, and Europe itself was in crisis. So I said, that's what we wanted. We've got it, and all three are in crisis. Great. Have to think hard and think on your feet. Don't expect somebody to fix it for you. Anyway, it is when I was reading Michael Walzer, my old professor from Harvard when I was a student. He wrote this book, Paradox of Liberation. It doesn't have to do with Central Europe. It's about Israel, India, Algeria. And basically, in one line, he says, well, these countries these nation states have been built in different contexts, obviously, by modernizing elites, modernizing secular elites. And that was supposed to open the way to a number of other developments after. But the cycle exhausted itself, and you have returned to conservative, national, religious. From Modi to you can do your list. So I thought his idea about the cycle exhausting itself after 25 years, perhaps he was onto something. Okay, my sixth hypothesis, no. No, why is, how come it's not? No, I want to go. No, 5 hypotheses. No, last. Okay. Last hypothesis is about the capacity to dismantle the illiberal legacy. And that the hypothesis, the question would be, it depends on the strengths and efficiency and impact of both the internal and domestic constraint, both, and they are both different. The internal, that's the resilience of civil society. And we have everywhere the societies, as I said, divided, polarized, etc. But what we have in Poland and what we don't have elsewhere, or certainly not to the same extent, is the capacity of civil society to resist that. And we have seen that in various forms in Poland. You can also make the hypothesis that this applies to, this follows from the capacity of civil society to resist under communism already and to be self-organized under communism. And again, Poland, we had discussions, I remember in the old days, about was Poland the exception because of Solidarność, etc., or was it the tip of the iceberg? Was it the showing the way, so to speak? Was it a magnifying glass for all the others? Well, we like to believe the second, but in many ways, Poland was the exception. Nowhere did you have a social movement encompassing the whole, practically the whole society, as in Poland. And I think that legacy of civil society resilience is certainly a point. You don't have it in Hungary in the same way. You certainly don't have it in Slovakia, etc., etc. And you have, of course, the cleavage that I mentioned between big cities and small cities, urban, rural. We have it everywhere, and the capacity of the big cities to lead the rest of the countries, not obvious proposition. I've run out of time. The external constraint, just in 2 words, and that's mostly focusing on the EU, or has been until now mainly focusing on the EU and the capacity by the EU to constrain and establish procedures, the sanctions procedures, examination reviews, etc. It produces, with, of course, the experience of Brexit as a sobering experiment. I mean, even for the hard Eurosceptic. And I remind people that the Eurosceptics in Central Europe, some of them, Orbán, Kaczynski, others, etc., have compared the European Union to the Soviet Union. Brussels frequently compared to Moscow. I mean, Polish Minister of Justice under peace, Ziobro, said it 10 times. Hungary Minister of Justice, Judith Varga, 20 times. Yeah, Moscow is, Brussels is the new Moscow. So what they discovered after Brexit is not only you lost a shining example of resisting Brussels dictates, etc., but mainly you discover that leaving is not really an option. For if you're a small country in Central Europe, which gets 3% of its GDP every year from the EU structural funds, you think twice before slamming the door. So that brought in a kind of sobering element, and that meant that perhaps that would be the hypothesis, that it allowed, it contained, let's say, the most extreme version of it. I've I did not do justice to the, somehow the slide disappeared, about the nature of the regime, the discussion how to label these regimes. The reason the constraint can work is because these regimes are not autocracies. It's not a system like in Russia. There are no political prisoners in Hungary. There are no Navalny's in Hungary. So it's a system that has done away with checks and balances and all the things we know. But it is quite important to keep that in mind, that there is a continuum, between liberal democracy weakened in Western Europe, illiberal democracies in Central Europe, in our area, and we have varieties. We had the Orbán-Kaczynski variety. We had also the Czech variety with Babiš. I call it entrepreneurial populism. Yeah, an entrepreneur buys media, steps into politics, gets to prime minister, and what the first thing he says, a state should be run like a company. Okay, parliament is a talk shop. Okay, these are quotes, okay? So this is populism of a certain type, but he's not going to the brink saying, I'm gonna do away with, I don't know, constitutional court or anything like that. Or he doesn't have any views, really serious views about Europe, except that he doesn't want Europe to be intruding into his business. And if the business is corrupt, EU is intruding. So so this is, well, I mean, you have a continuum from liberal democracies weakened in Western Europe, in Central Europe, illiberal varieties of populist, illiberal democracies, and explicitly authoritarian dictatorships further east. And that European constraints, it works when on the second category, couldn't work on the third. And final point, the de-democratization has become, with the war in Ukraine, back to where I started, a major geopolitical constraint. You may be drifting to the limits, to the brink of what the EU can take from you, but you think twice before going overboard, because there is a geopolitical dimension of democracy. So suddenly, geopolitics and democracy become closely intertwined. And even Orbán is aware of that. The one final thought is that just as in 2016, he was saying, I was ahead of the game, now that Trump is making him the key interlocutor in Europe, suddenly the Central European regression from democracy, the illiberal democracy, has bigger ambitions. And the new ambitions for Orbán is not just Hungary, not just Central European V4, etc., but recasting Europe. He created his new group of patriots, etc., and that's his ambition. He said it openly in a speech as he was taking over the European Union presidency, which he now holds. He said, our goal is to transform Europe and to conquer Brussels. To conquer Brussels. This is a quote again. So this is a complete shift of paradigm. These were things happening at the periphery of the European Union. The ambition now is to recast the center. Sorry,
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so we can directly open the floor. Please don't hesitate to ask questions or make any comments. Wojciech, please.
Good morning, good evening. I'm Wojciech Białorzec. I am actually part of Geremek Foundation. So thank you for recalling Professor Geremek here. And I'm very pleased to tell you that in 2 weeks, EUI will name a room after Professor Geremek at School of Transnational Governance. It is part of the EUI presidency of Poland this year. And actually, my comment is about this liberal exhaustion that you have mentioned. And my quick comment would be that actually, in Poland, where people discuss currently the redemocratization by the new governmental coalition, I would say that there is no chance for redemocratization in Poland because the Tusk government, his coalition, is actually part of this exhausted liberal elite, and he himself is a incarnation of this exhausted liberal elite. So I have pretty much a pessimistic view on Poland's potential redemocratization, and I would actually claim that this exhaustion of liberal elite in Poland is actually a lasting element, and there will not be a sustainable redemocratization of Poland under this particular governmental coalition. Thank you.
Yes, I have skipped one because I was running out of time. I skipped one part, which was supposed to be the optimistic. I gave a pretty gloomy picture of the state of democracy in Central Europe. And I was supposed to end on a more upbeat note. And that was both about the internal and the external, the internal civil society. But the internal means essentially the capacity to reverse the illiberal drift. And that means that has as a condition accepting alternation, that the populist nationalists accept election results, something Donald Trump had, as you know, problem with on January 6th, 4 years ago. And incidentally, a sigh of relief for many Americans was, well, disappointment that it was a bad night for Democrats, but it was a relief for those who feared that there would be an assault on democratic institutions in case he lost and challenged the result. This has not happened in Poland, and it's very important. The reversal of the illiberal regression that I had been trying to describe, define, interpret, capacity to reverse the first of all on accepting the election. And Poland clearly shows that it is possible, that it is, that you can not just have alternation in power back, but that you can attempt to dismantle that legacy. And I would be interested to know more about what you think. I mean, as you see, they went first after the media, the new government, the return of the liberals, so to speak. But you've seen what they did. They shut down the public broadcasting, reopened for business the next morning. Well, this is, let's say, a pretty illiberal way of dealing with the problem. And therefore, my question is, can you dismantle an illiberal regime with illiberal methods? Or is that the only way to do it? Because I posed the question to some of the people in Poland, and they said, yes, it was a problem, etc., but there was no other way to do it. Well, my then observation is, well, if that's the way you do it, and you may have good reasons for that, I don't deny that, what happens next time if, I mean, I just said alternation in power works. Well, there will be alternation in power at some point. What arguments will you have against whoever it is if they try to do exactly what you're doing? So that is a problem. This is why I say Poland is a laboratory, because none of us knows. What you can do in overnight with the media, you cannot do. It's much more difficult with the judiciary. You have the Supreme Court, you have all the courts, you have the nomination of the judges. I mean, this is a very complex, very difficult issue. And what to do about the Constitutional Court? I mean, should you dissolve the Constitutional Court? I mean, how far do you go in the assault on an illiberal takeover of the institutions? This is, I think, a fascinating problem, and perhaps our Polish guests will have better answers than I have. I have more questions about that rather than answers.
Very quickly, the other day we had a great talk with Calypso on the so-called militant democracy. So this concept in which democracy uses not particularly democratic methods to defend itself, and it was developed in the 1930s in the German context. And interestingly, Donald Tusk has recently used this term of militant democracy. I guess he was using it to try a little bit to disperse the criticism of inaction that he was facing. I'm not sure if he is that much committed to militant democracy. So this is just a comment responding to how actually liberals can dismantle illiberal democracy's legacies. Thank you.
Okay, other comments, questions? Yes, please.
I'm Maciej Górecki. I'm a Brodel Fellow here in the Political and Social Science Department, and permanently I work at the University of Warsaw. I want to thank you for an interesting talk, and I just want to focus on one of the hypotheses that you mentioned, and actually also if you accept, I will give you sort of my working hypothesis why this populism might develop. I mean, first I would like to talk briefly about the first one, the economic hypothesis. I mean, you mentioned Trump, you mentioned Kaczynski, like USA and Poland, and you see that economically these are completely different countries. I mean, USA is a knowledge economy where indeed there is this deindustrialization in the small towns and so on, huge inequality, wealthy country, but with huge inequality. Then you have Poland, where low inequality. We get this the Western deindustrialization gives jobs to us. So there is pretty low inequality, and actually the standard of living of sort of, so to speak, ordinary people increases. So it's a completely different situation economically. And then you have populism, the same, I mean, very similar political phenomenon that occurs in two settings with so different economic circumstances. So how possibly can it be even considered a serious argument if you have such a discrepancy in the explanatory variable and the same outcome? So so my view, it would be that it's really not a serious hypothesis. I will tell you my hypothesis. That is, I think this can be taken under the umbrella of the culture wars. So my hypothesis, I mean, it's to some extent it's a joke, of course, but my hypothesis is that people want to vote for populists because of the many emerging lifestyle discourses originated in the left that will, for example, tell you, yeah, when you drink 3 beers and eat a burger from time to time, you will become an alcoholic and you die. And there's a lot of this. And these populists come and they say, yeah, these people are crazy. We give you a common sense solutions and so on. So I believe this cultural, very broadly considered hypothesis looks to me much more serious than the economic one, because simply the comparison between Poland or other Central Eastern European countries and the US I mean, it's simply, you know, logically, it just seems that this economic hypothesis is simply not serious. Thanks once again for the interesting presentation.
Well, perhaps I introduce with my Richard Rorty quotation too much of a focus on am I comparing US and Poland? And of course, I'm aware of the big differences between the two countries. What struck me in the Richard Rorty quote is he pointed his finger, he put his finger on something, I think, which exists not just in the United States, but also in Poland, and not just in Poland, but a number of other societies you have really two kinds of societies. Yes, the Silicon Valley and the Rust Belt is not the same thing. And you have the two types of economies and different type of electorates. And this is why when I mentioned the deplorables that Hillary Clinton misunderstood, you know, just, I mean, her answer to that is, you're losing your job, move to Silicon Valley. Well, you know, if you've been mining for 30 years, that may not be an obvious proposition. Anyway, Move to Kansas was a famous book. Okay, what's new? What's the matter with Kansas? Okay, so the answer would be move to Kansas. Okay, why not? So no, I don't want to overdo the. I perhaps skewed my argument to the American-Polish. No, I'm not comparing Poland, Polish and American economy. I'm comparing what the globalization and the transformation has done to different kind of societies. And I understand they are different, but yes, you have the so-called winners and losers of the transition, just as you discussed the winners and losers of globalization. And you can identify in Poland, and Polish sociologists have shown that. There are, and then you look at the electoral map, and you have interesting correlations to point to as well. So I think that the urban-rural is an important big town, small town, and that may be more important than the actual state of the economy. And then you have the socio-economic background to it and the level of education that goes with it. I mean, a number of things that then are related to that, to urban, more income, higher levels of education, more likely to vote for Platforma. Yeah, that's not rocket science. It seems fairly clear. Incidentally, since I'm talking the historical maps, I mean, there is a socioeconomic argument we are discussing. It doesn't work for the latest elections, but it works for a number of the elections before. The historical maps, I didn't bring them, but you put together the electoral map of PiS and Platforma, and you look at the historical map of the partition of Poland, you have an interesting food for thought there as well. So yeah, I'm not saying this is the first hypothesis is the only one. That's why I presented 6, and there is a debate now among specialists. You say this is a self-evident truth, etc. No, lots of specialists who argue this is a key variable. Now, you may dispute that, and in fact, I'm closer to you in that respect. I don't think that the socioeconomic argument is the only one. In fact, Poland, from that point of view, would not be necessarily the best case, because you could show that in relative terms, Polish economy continued to grow. It was the only country which was not hit by the 2008-9 crisis the way others were. And yeah, you could relativize, let's say, the socioeconomic argument. But otherwise, I can tell you, the literature on the subject, on populism and illiberal trends is vastly dominated by that argument in all the languages. I mean, this applies to American literature. It applies to French scholarship on the subject, etc. This is a very important plank. And my argument usually is the opposite of yours. I'm the one who is trying to relativize it, but not dismiss it. I mean, that would be too far.
Okay.
Okay. My name is Artan. I'm a Jean Monnet Fellow here. I'm from Kosovo originally. So thank you for the presentation. And there was a lot into it, from periodization to all the hypotheses. So it's really difficult to comment it because almost everything is there with what you can agree and maybe add some things. Maybe we're missing a lot of out-migration from some countries, demographic change and so on. But I'm just wondering whether this time we need some maybe a micro theory, something else to explain this phenomenon of, for example, in anthropology, emulation. I study social policy sometimes, write a lot about it on Balkans and Eastern Europe. And what you can see often is not really these countries. It's not the left or the rise of a certain party and something that is producing a policy. It's often administrations, some people working with policy, looking at another country, emulating. So maybe what we have to do is a favor, a new emulation of technologies of maintaining power. You know, some people in power that are just ahead of the game, and they are emulating technologies successfully and thus maintaining their power. So that's my point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Damien. I'm a visiting researcher here at the SPS. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on something you mentioned that I found very interesting, this idea of entrepreneurial populism. Because I was wondering, I mean, you mentioned Andrej Babic, but I was wondering, this is kind of a strategy or a part of the appeal of Trump. Many people voted because of cultural wars, but others voted simply because they believed that he could kind of fix the economy, right? So simply out of self-interest. And then in terms of this notion of running a government as a company, as a business, to me, you didn't mention this explicitly, but the first thing that came to mind is now having Trump appoint Elon Musk as this Department of Efficiency. And I was wondering, wouldn't that be a great way to start kind of carving out democratic checks and balances and institutions in the name of efficiency and making things more economic? I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I was wondering if you could expand. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques, for this very broad and fascinating presentation, and I apologize for my voice. I'm just wondering what to do with our debates about multi-causal historical developments. So you have your 5 hypotheses, and then you have the 6. So one clarification, just to try to read your mind, is whether your conclusion is really what you think is the most important, your 6 hypotheses. But that is societal resilience and EU resilience, if we will. In which case, I would interpret your 6 as enabling conditions. You know, when we ask under what conditions does this variable or this variable become more important, more potent in the explanation. I mean, civil society resilience varies. I mean, there's not some sort of variable called civil society resilience. And EU resilience or EU rule of law is being pretty much ineffective. And I would argue effective to the extent that it is relayed by civil society. I mean, even in Hungary, where for the first time the EU flexed its muscles in terms of the conditionality of regional aid, etc., it hasn't moved the needle very much. It can empower the mayors, who can in turn magnifies the voice of certain civil society actors. So there's some sort of something there together. But I think that what we're hearing is that your core contrast, and the core contrast that is common. I mean, we have all the differences, but the core contrast is between the social economic explanation, inequality, etc., versus the culture wars, the cultural. And that's what we just heard again now in terms of, identity. And I would say that I would love to hear Anna, who edited this wonderful book, Let's Agree on Poland, which I don't know if you've read. And of course, there's a lot there on, the identity and tradition explanation. I mean, as we already heard, but love to hear you as you relate to the different hypotheses, which you discuss under different kind of labels in your introduction. And you also have a take on how to push back on Jack's slat. So just a little encouragement to jump in. But I wonder, how far do we go? I mean, I think that we've heard many arguments, including from you, as to if we take really the biggest contrast between socioeconomic and culture, identity, and all of these things, which are not fungible. How much as social scientists do we want to be inspired by cross-country comparisons, find big patterns, like all these big books on democracy, they have their one variable. And I think there would be argument for both columns. But at the same time, everybody is insisting on the fact that Hungary and Poland, for instance, we're doing well economically, et cetera. It's very hard to go with the socioeconomic in their case. So, well, Philip, you might, I'd love to hear what you think too, but if that's the case, then we do fall back on this angst of the time, this cultural angst that is related. I mean, in both cases, we have a problem of openness. Openness is the problem economically as well as culturally. But it's a very different button that you're pushing with openness when you create the openness that creates socioeconomic inequality versus the openness that creates identity angst, cultural wars, etc. And at the end of the day, what seems to really be shared by so many of these contexts of illiberal democracy and authoritarian populism is indeed the cultural thing. And it's that thing that the left, pushed too far and all of that. So just wondering what you think there.
Well, I agree with much of what you said, especially at the end. I think that we had, I gave 6 hypotheses, my Pirandello variation. Simply, I'm well aware that the 2 main ones are the ones you mentioned. That's what comes up most in the discussion. But if we're talking about Central Europe, you want to be aware of the historical background, of the specific nature of nations constructing it. This is a nation building, cultural nation, language, culture, religion, etc. Before you move from cultural to political nation. Okay, 19th century awakening, Czechs, Slovaks, Macedonians become nation when? Difficult to know. One date would be when their language is codified by a Harvard grammarian, Harvard linguist. So it's no longer dialect, it becomes a language. If it's a language, it's a nation. If it's a nation, well, it needs a state, it needs a flag, it needs an army, etc., etc. So it's called nation state building. And so there are latecomers. Some of them are coming some of them came late 20th century, like the case I'm just mentioning. Most East Central European were part of the 19th century a revival. And more or less, if you missed the 1870, the Italian and German unification train, you then were in a different context, because you were building a nation state in a democratic environment. In 1870, you were not quite in a democratic environment. It's difficult to build a new state with pluralist, democratic, liberal means. So anyway, that's a digression, but that's my case for keeping specific features. Then there is the legacy of communism. You have countries that for half a century did not have, I mean, with the Nazi period and then the Soviet period, you have half a century where you do not have democratic development. And you have, and this is where the Geremek quotes comes from. Yes, dissent became a rehabilitation of the language of rights. You moved away from the ideological challenge to power to human rights, rule of law, constitutionalism, etc. And that prepared the ground for 1989. So that was a liberal legacy that came in 1989, but it was carried by a relatively small section. I mean, people wanted democracy, but those who were carrying those kind of ideas about liberal democracy were a relatively limited group. So I'm saying there is a general debate that dominated by the two main explanations you gave. And then you have a number of specific features. And the nation state building, I mean, you want to discuss, I mean, there's Milica Ubaric here, you want to discuss why the democratic transitions were derailed by sometimes semi-authoritarian, sometimes explicitly authoritarian regimes in the Balkans. So it had a lot to do with the breakup of a federation and building new nation states. And when you're building new nation states, you don't have room for pluralism, democracies, and things like that. L'union sacrée, yeah, that's what. Anyway, so this is, since my brief was about East Central Europe, well, then but it's part of a global debate, obviously, with the two main competing explanations. And basically what one would have to do with the hypothesis I presented, you have to establish a hierarchy of those hypotheses. And obviously the two ones, the two you have mentioned are the dominant ones. I introduce the last one because I think it is very important. There is nothing predetermined. There are illiberals, there are populists, but there are those who succeed and those who don't. And those who are installed and those who can be reversed. And that depends, that is, I see, at least for the future, and for Europe, that is the most interesting debate. That depends on, on the two things I mentioned, civil society and the European constraint. And I totally agree that it hasn't been effective. If we have to explain why, essentially the short answer for what, some 15 years, 10, a good decade, 15 years, let's say, Orbán was protected by the EPP, by the German Christian Democrats, and Austrian, German and Austrian. That alliance has been formed progressively, started on the day Wolfgang Schüssel made an alliance with Haider in Austria. You see, Central Europe. Schüssel, Haider, right with extreme right. Immediately Europe says he's ostracized. Chirac is up in arms. For 1 year, they are being in quarantine, suspended. Who is the first person who does a press conference with poor, isolated Schüssel? Certain Viktor Orbán, who's an Hungarian prime minister. He's not member of the European Union, but he knows that it may one day apply to him. And that alliance, Orbán, Schussel, and the Bavarian CSU has formed at that time. I will not inflict the details on you, but since this is about Central Europe, you want to know the full story. This is about Beneš decrees and the confiscation of property of Germans and of Hungarians in Czechoslovakia in 1945. That was the alliance. Orbán, Schussel, they have three conditions. And Bavarian CSU at that time adopted a resolution saying that Czechoslovakia must abrogate 1945 decrees if the Czechs want to join the European Union, seconded by Schussel and Orbán, etc. You form this. Later, CDU adopted the same line. Anyway, this is a long answer to explain that this hasn't happened overnight, that Orbán even before coming into the EU, and he has long been protected from actual EU countermeasures, so to speak, by his membership in the EPP. Okay, what is it, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, he was finally expelled by the EPP. And you know who was instrumental in expelling him from EPP? Donald Tusk. Donald Tusk also, platform is also. And Donald Tusk made a formidable speech at a Congress of the EPP where, I mean, it's rhetorical. If you are suppressing the freedom of the media, you are not a real liberal Christian Democrat, etc. If you are doing this and that, you are not a real Christian. And he goes through the whole speech is like that, the 10 things that Orbán and Kaczynski, of course, he's talking about Orbán and he's talking to him, but he's, of course, also talking about Kaczynski. You have there the two positions, and that's the end of the protection by EPP for Viktor Orbán. And that's when Europe starts taking seriously measures. You ask why have not they implemented some of them before? Well, they dodged the issue each time it came up, you know. So they started late and not very effectively, but they eventually got there. And I would agree on one thing you said, that is the European constraint works only if there is the other constraint, the constraint from the civil society, if the two converge. The reason why there is such support for the European Union in a country like Poland is because during the whole Kaczynski period, they were also seen as a kind of garde-fou, as a kind of limit. And even in Hungary, 2/3 of the people support membership in the EU, partly because, not only because of the economic benefits, but because they think it is a kind of, a garde-fou, protection against going beyond. So, yeah, that's, but perhaps that would be the interesting discussion to have, you know, what is the hierarchy of the priority among the hypotheses, and what is the interplay between them. And the specific nature of East Central Europe requires that you have more than the two of them. You have specific nature of nation state building, and the political culture is different, and the historical weakness of liberalism. I mean, so that these are specific features that then come to the fore in a particular context, which is now getting rather worrying, because what used to be seen in the post-89 context as the external anchor for the democracies of Central Europe, that is the EU and the United States, the liberal democracy, Britain and the US were constantly referred to as the models. Well, if one goes to Brexit and has 4 governments in 3 years or whatever, Liz Truss, I think, was the shortest, 3 months, I think, and in the United States you have Trump. Your external anchor is is gone. All you're left with is EU. And we know, Calypso knows better than anybody in what state the EU is and its capacity to deliver in tackling issues like that. So I raised it more as a hypothesis. I'm not totally convinced it will work.
Okay, I guess we will collect more. So there, first you and then Anna. Yes.
Oh, there was also, yeah. So you.
Yeah,
So
so
please, very quick. Everybody.
very quick, okay. Well, it's
Yeah,
really-
I'm
there's so
agree with
much.
the questions.
It's like-
Quite quick.
Well, okay, and related to everything that you've been saying, I mean, there are two thoughts that came to mind. One was something that would also unite the cultural and economic is the opposition between local and global and the anxieties that recur throughout history, the identitarian insecurities that recur. And it's actually, it's related to the question of, do you see history as is this cyclic? You're talking about the cycles of 25 years. Is this just basically another inevitable cycle? Or is that kind of linear thing we're seeing here? I was thinking of the opposition 19th century or 18th century folk civilization, the folk sentiment, Central Europe, Germany, identity, and so on, versus the global rationalist Enlightenment civilization. Are we seeing versions of this with the kind of retrenchment and, of nationalist sentiment versus the kind of divided identity politics of the liberal, global identity politics of the liberal left-wing, international? I mean, are we seeing these oppositions constantly happening? The retrenchment in economic retrenchment versus globalized economies and so on and so forth. Is this basically a cycle? Is this something new? It's a lot of questions in one.
The answer is probably both. That is, you have cycles indeed, and you have something new. The globalization context in this respect is new, and it has reinforced everywhere the cultural response or the identity politics associated with it. So that's what globalization does, but it has specific features in Central Europe. So in this sense, the local, the fallback onto the nation, the migration crisis was I think a perfect illustration of that. You had really the opposition of the two arguments. The argument of Angela Merkel, why are we opening our doors? Well, because of universal human rights, etc. Because of European values, she said, which are universal human rights. Well, that is how you define Europe. And then the other lot says, well, we are actually building a fence on the Hungarian border because we are protecting European civilization. We are protecting our nation, but we are protecting European civilization. So you have both refer to Europe, but a very different idea of Europe. And of course, you want to, I mean, there is something, I mean, the Merkel's universalist, you have the universalist argument that Merkel uses. You have Ulrich Beck. What is Europe? Substantial void and total openness. It's norms, etc., liberal, substantial void, really? Total openness. Well, sounds good for a philosopher to put, the two arguments, and I'm the inheritor of Enlightenment, universalism, etc. But you are facing the people I've been talking about for an hour. You have no chance whatsoever. And then when you said, how far do we go back? You mentioned 18th century and the two views, the universalist. And in Central Europe, precisely, you have a curious combination of the two. Because you mentioned, well, let's say French Enlightenment, universal, and the folkish, the German, the romantic reaction to that. But in the German Enlightenment, you have Herder. And what Herder, I mean, his idea of the Volksgeist, each nation, even small, I mean, but it comes from a Protestant, minister, a very different view from those who inherited the Catholic University, but a Protestant, where language matters. And because you translate the Bible into the different vernaculars, etc. And what Herder says that each national group has its own unique Volksgeist, which rests in is language and culture, etc. So the idea is you reach the universal through the particular. That is Herder. If it were just, universalist versus particularist, we're okay. With Herder, the plot thickens because in Central Europe, you can try to be both. I mean, doesn't always work, but you have that. But of course, the idea of the Volksgeist then can be picked up all the way to the present. And when you have, wir schaffen das, and we do it because we believe in universal human rights. Great. But once we're protecting civilization, just as we did at the time of the Turkish conquest. To understand what it's about, you have to understand that the Turks were in Budapest, that for a century and a half, the capital of Hungary was not in Budapest, but in a town called Pozsony in Hungarian, Pressburg in German, and Bratislava is its current name. So you have to, this is why, not just because I've been trained as a historian, but I believe history matters. And historical debates and political philosophy debates from the Enlightenment of the 19th century matter if you want to understand. When the Czech president, Miloš Zeman, goes to Budapest and he congratulates Viktor Orbán on his fans and says, you are fulfilling again the role Hungarians have performed in the 16th century at the Battle of Mohács. You've been the rampart against the Turk, etc., etc. You'd say, what is he talking about? We are in 2016, and we have a migration debate in Europe, and he's talking to me about the 16th century. Thank you because you performed the same task. Okay, the rampart. Our role is to be the rampart. Same argument you would hear. That was in Croatia, historically, etc., etc. So I don't want to overdo the historical arguments because
yeah, I think that there were more questions and comments. Anna, please.
I'm Anna Wojciuk. I'm a Brodel Fellow here at the UI, and my position is at the University of Warsaw. Thank you for this very erudite presentation and the broad panorama. And thank you, Calypso, for bringing our volume to the debate. I happen to be a co-author and editor of a book developed by a group of Polish intellectuals, which is going to be published next year in OUP. And last year it was a bestseller in Poland. So this is just to bring what Calypso mentioned. And in terms of your hypothesis, I think that in order to deal with this phenomenon of authoritarian right, which we have all over the world, I believe we should try to eliminate hypotheses which are less plausible rather than adding up. Because I think that we see this phenomenon in very, very different setups, and also in setups which we didn't mention today, like Brazil, India, Philippines, and among various social classes. Because if you look at India and Brazil, this is middle class who are really winners of globalization, which are voting for Bolsonaro and Modi. So I think that even though myself, I am fully for economic equality, I just don't believe this moves us to better understanding and correctly answering to what's happening around. And also your idea that East Central Europe has a certain specificity, I don't deny that, but the fact is that if you study what Bolsonaro says, what Duterte say, these are really very similar narratives. So how you can have such an equifinality among such different cases? So in my view, methodologically, adding up more hypotheses and saying, oh, we should look at specificity of in Central Europe, I believe we are not getting closer to the solution. And myself, being, as I said, fully for economic equality, I believe these are cultural privileges being lost by certain groups who just who just want to defend them. This is my hypothesis. But going back to your last part of the presentation, how to get out from this quandrum, our book, Let's Agree on Poland, argues that we need to have some basic agreement with the other side about the rules of the game. And myself, of course, on the democratic side in Poland, but I happen to believe that if they use illiberal means to restore democracy, when they lose power, which can happen in 3 years easily, none of that will be respected. And we are in Argentine scenario, every new government, new constitutional court, and so on. Even if the president is from the democratic side, of course, the government will not respect the constitutional court. So we are not on the path to restoring consolidated democracy, because as such, it should be a set of rules on which all major parts agree. And that's not part of the game. Now, this is what we try to convince all parts, that there should be some basic rules on which we can agree with the other side. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your very interesting comment. On the last one, you notice that my hypothesis was a question mark, and I explicitly, I think, said, can you dismantle an illiberal regime with illiberal methods, creating a precedent for next time? Okay, I think I said as much. So I'm both hopeful that it may be possible. I'm very doubtful about some of the methods being used. And in fact, it's going to backfire when there is next alternation in power. Secondly, you're doing something to the political culture. I mean, the political culture is something you build over time, okay? And liberal democracy rests at the end of the day by, as I said, the actors having internalized the constitutional constraint on them. What is happening is not something that is going to help internalize the constitutional constraints. It's undermining it in many ways. So I can see that it's done for good reasons, so to speak. But, you know, as we know, hell is paved with good intentions. So I would go in your direction, but I thought I said as much. I hope I was not misunderstood. Yes, I present 6 hypotheses. I should have explicitly said, here is a hierarchy of hypotheses, etc. I don't think all of them have the same explanatory values. Given that I was supposed to address specifically East Central European situation, I could talk about situation in France. I'm happy to do that, or in Western Europe, etc. So I was trying to also look at some of the specific East Central European features, and there are that. But I'm not saying that they so to speak, have primacy, and I don't think history is sort of deterministic in this way. That's why I put the 6 hypotheses is in fact perhaps the most important one in many respects. But there is a whole debate. Okay, so if we shift from Central Europe to rest, there is a whole debate about the rise of authoritarian regime or semi-authoritarian regime. Yes, there's a whole literature of that. I'm perfectly aware of it, of course. And perhaps not in the power. Yeah, I think in the power. But of course, there's supposed to be a whole page about how to define the regimes. Okay, I said it's no longer liberal democracy. It's not autocracy, Russian style. We have situations in between. You have what Levitsky and Way have called competitive authoritarianism. That is, you still have elections, though they are not quite free and fair. It's not a level playing field. It's not a level playing field, but you can still run, contest, and even, as in the Polish case, have a chance to win. So this is a specific distinction between an authoritarian regime and competitive authoritarianism, as Levitsky and Way put it. And I think that this is where we are. These are kind of hybrid regimes. And then, of course, one would have to qualify, you know, there was a Polish situation, the Hungarian situation, drifting, what many people think now is increasingly an authoritarian regime. Not the case of the Czech Republic under Babiš. Babiš will return. He will be trying to do, he's moving closer to Orbán, and we will have in Central Europe, I mean, right now we have Slovakia, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, okay? This will change when Babiš next year comes to power, and we will have a new realignment, much closer to what Orbán is after. Okay, these are shifts in Central Europe, but it's part of a broader picture. I totally agree. Yes, Bolsonaro, and you saw that Viktor Orbán went to the inauguration of the Argentine president. You know, you would say, what the hell is he doing there? What you know? Or you want another illustration? Take Bibi Netanyahu's election campaign. What, 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years and a half, the last election, big posters where you have Bibi Netanyahu, and then you have Trump, Bolsonaro, Orbán, and Putin. This is election poster. And you know what is written underneath? This is the First League. These are the guys who know how to deal with. So you want a definition of the authoritarian international? Yeah, well, you have them there. And you have then varieties of them. A lot of them is politics of nostalgia. Russia and Putin, obviously, the imperial nostalgia. Erdogan, of course, post-Ottoman rhetoric and post-Ottoman Trump, make America great again, the politics of nostalgia. Orbán, to some extent, with his Trianon obsession, the loss of the greater Hungarian space, perhaps could fit partially in that category. But yes, we have there and the picture from Bibi Netanyahu is probably, from his campaign, is probably the best illustration of what we are talking about. Yeah, global rift of authoritarian. I stress the Central European feature, but my God, I mean, I'm perfectly aware. And what I said at the beginning, and I can only stress, is Trump's election makes a big difference. Big difference. I was in Prague this weekend. I noticed how many supporters, how many people are, you know, cheered up by Trump's win. Similar situation in a number of Balkan countries, etc., etc. This will have an impact on European politics, and not just Central European, on European politics. So sorry if I gave too much of a Central European view, but that was supposed to be my brief.
Okay, do you want a very quick one?
Milica Uvalic, visiting at the Robert Schuman Center. I was fascinated by the hypotheses that you gave us, because in fact, this is something I have myself been thinking a lot about these 30 years since the transition started. Now, you who have been so much involved in the Western Balkans, in practically all the countries, and you know these countries very well, how do you dismantle illiberal regimes in these countries? Where do you start from? Is it the systems of education? Because, you know, the civil society is quite developed, I would say, in all these countries. Is there any hope? I wanted your opinion about whether there is hope for the Western Balkans.
Okay, can I be a provider of hope? Well, that's a mission some intellectuals took on in the 20th century. It didn't always end well for them. But the hope, let me put it this way. The Balkans, as I mentioned, and I could have made a different talk about comparing Central Europe and the Balkans, but which incidentally would have gone, oh, Central European was supposed to be the democratic success story, transformation, etc. The Balkans were drifting towards kind of semi-authoritarian nationalist regime in the midst of building nation states, etc. But the picture has become more complex when you see that Serbian President Vučić has as a key partner Viktor Orbán and Fico, big supporters. So he has inside the EU, probably the most illiberal leader in the Balkans is a close ally of two members of the EU, and who they are from Central Europe. So suddenly, Central Europe, you know, we are leading the way, and the Balkans are. So the two models, the two is being eroded, and that affects, in fact, also the debates about enlargement, about the future of enlargement. The idea being, well, not just, oh my God, the Balkan, how complex, etc. No, it's, do we need another Orbán in the EU? And okay, on the more hopeful, the only prospect I can see is, first, in the smaller countries. It is much easier to turn around Montenegro with 500,000 population than a country like Serbia. So economically, politically, it's okay. I don't have to explain. Just as it was easier to turn around Estonia than Ukraine. Okay, so size matters, and so the hopeful signs from the Balkans I would see in the smaller countries. Montenegro, Macedonia, possibly Albania. And if the EU uses the Ukrainian momentum, because EU has promised, you know, accession to EU, to Ukraine on democracy grounds. Okay, we want to enlarge the circle of democracies, etc. So if the EU is serious about Ukraine, it must get the Balkan train moving, because the credibility of what you say to Ukraine, what is the credibility of what you say to Ukraine about its European prospect, if the countries to which you've promised the same thing 20 years ago are still in the waiting room? So that's clearly a non-starter. So the only way, I would say, hope for the Balkans, use the Ukrainian moment. That's the first thing. Second, size matters. Use the dynamics of smaller countries, which can more easily, well, make political change. And we have seen this could happen in Montenegro. We had it in Macedonia. Unfortunately, the European Union dropped the ball before the Macedonians could actually consolidate what they had achieved. They did something very brave, which is changing the name of their country. Not many people would do that. And they did it by agreement with Greece, the main block to their entry into the EU. So they did it on behalf of the EU, in the name of the EU, and EU dropped the ball, particularly France and Holland. Okay, so this is this is, I would say, that would be the strategy. The hope would come from changes in those countries. And if that were to happen, if, let's say, Montenegro and Macedonia were to join the EU, it would have immediate effect on Serbia. Would have immediately. At the moment, the dominant mood is we pretend that we are interested. Nobody believes in it. You look at the opinion polls. Do you trust the EU? Majority of Serbs said no, no. And the reason they don't trust it, because 20 years ago, they were told they have European prospects. And frankly, and incidentally, 20 years ago, Serbia had a different kind of leadership. So this is, my hope would be that the Ukrainian moment, that is the emphasis on EU enlargement directly related to a geopolitical argument, one, and to a democratic argument. We are supporting Ukraine because it is a European democracy. If we want to support it, preserve it, encourage it, we must offer European. The same argument would have to apply in the Balkans too, and they can use that momentum. And I'm pretty sure that if that train got moving, let's say with some of the small countries, Serbia too would change. And those opinion polls where you see, we now have majority of people who do not have trust in the EU, which is a considerable decline. The trust is the highest in Albania, Kosovo, etc. It's low in Serbia, but simply because the prospect is not plausible. And so long as the prospect is not plausible, Vučić can pretend he receives Ursula von der Leyen frequently, gets congratulated by Ursula von der Leyen, and he doesn't do anything to, he does basically Orbanization of Serbia. So if we want to reverse it, show that the enlargement train can work, and that will create a dynamic for Serbian society, hopefully, and Serbian electorates to change the situation.
Okay, we have run out of time, so I think that we will end on this relatively optimistic note, I guess. Let's give Professor Rupnik another round of applause. Thanks everyone for attending. I remind you that tomorrow there's another event by Sasha Mezarovic, a book presentation on the Balkans, so please don't miss it. It's at 5 tomorrow.